Now I'm assuming that we are joined by Riaz Karim, Director of Veritas Center for Strategic Studies, to tell us more about what he thinks. Now, the main question right now is, how will this affect Turkey's relation, on the one hand, with Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, with the United States, considering the fact that Pastor Brunson was recently sent back to the United States? It seemed that the U.S.-Turkey relations were going back on track. And, of course, it seems very obvious that Turkey has some kind of evidence that it is not providing, it's holding it back. Is it going to use anything as a bargaining chip? Dr. Riyad Karim, or I'm very sorry, Mark Dankoff, a broadcaster from the Ugly Truth Radio Network. Mr. Dankoff, I would...
How are you?
Thank you very much for joining us on Press TV on this very important issue. We're running out of time, but do you need me to repeat the question?
Yes, if you would, just for a moment.
Yes. First of all, we would like to know, in your opinion, Turkey seems to be having some kind of evidence that it is not providing, it's not making public. Do you think that it is going to use any of this as a bargaining chip? And how will the whole Khashoggi case affect Turkey's relations with Saudi Arabia on the one hand and the U.S. on the other?
Well, I think clearly Turkey has additional evidence that is not yet to be seen publicly. It's unknown to me to what extent they've conveyed this, both to the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, who has arrived in Istanbul. And as well, we're unclear as to what the Turks have said to the Saudis on this particular subject. But it's quite obvious to me what has basically gone on in this Khashoggi disappearance and death. It leads right up into the highest levels of the Saudi Arabian government. Clearly, it was a premeditated killing. And so at this particular juncture, I would suppose Turkey is, as Dr. Philip Giraldi suggested in an interview recently with your Tasnim news agency, the Turks are going to use whatever it is that they have to gain additional leverage from the United States and from Saudi Arabia, so that all three of these governments can basically put this incident to bed and pretend like the whole thing has been investigated thoroughly and that all three governments have acted responsibly in the situation.
Now I'm told that we're also joined by Jason Unruhe to discuss this further. Jason, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Well, Jason, in your opinion, how do you think this whole Khashoggi case will be affecting the relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Turkey and the United States on the other? And let's not forget that Pastor Bronson was recently sent back to the United States. We thought that U.S.-Turkey relations were going back on track.
Well, it did certainly seem that way. Once the pastor was released back to the U.S., it seemed like that Turkey was perhaps coming around and willing to be more compliant to U.S. desires. This has always been a point of contention since the U.S. made it very clear that it was going to be using Kurdish forces inside of Syria as a proxy army, which are known to carry out terrorist attacks against Turkey. This situation is kind of complicated. Essentially, Turkey is trying to court the United States back into having good relations with them once again, try to get rid of some of the sanctions and whatnot, the tariffs off of the country so that they can return to business as usual. Meanwhile, you have Saudi Arabia, who is essentially a client of the United States. They're great allies. The United States is going to let them get away with whatever it is that they want to get away with in order to keep that relationship and have them carrying out U.S. interests inside the region, including funneling a great deal of money to opposition groups or outright terrorist groups which attack various countries. The problem is that this may have been something that went a bit too far for the United States' liking. So Saudi Arabia has now after having had such a free hand to do whatever it is that they want inside of the Middle East, so long as they maintained close ties with the U.S., seem to have crossed that line into something that would now make the United States look bad in the international situation. Apparently, the lives of the Yemeni people were certainly not enough to bring shame to the United States, but the attacking of someone who was a U.S. resident seems to be that kind of tipping point. So essentially, the Saudis know that they've gone too far this time, and what they're trying to do is downplay this as much as possible, and try to have this all move along so that everybody can forget about it. However, in this case, Turkey is trying to court the United States and is rightfully outraged at this situation. So what you have is essentially two smaller powers, one that's trying to court the United States and one that is largely in the pocket of the United States, having an argument right now. They're having a whole row over this disagreement between the two countries, and the United States is kind of stuck in the middle. They can't just say, they can't ignore the situation. They just can't ignore the killing, but they can't defend it either, and nor can they come down too hard on the Saudis who carry out their interests in the region for fear that they may decide not to do so. The last time there was a great row between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, there was a spike in the oil prices. So it's best if relations between the two remain as smooth as possible. However, the Saudis seem to have really riled up the U.S. and done something that has reflected upon them and made them look bad, in this case, at least in the eyes of the American public, people who are going to express the kind of dissatisfaction that, despite Trump's nationalist rhetoric, that he has allowed the killing of someone who was a U.S. resident to take place by a foreign state, one that is so heavily allied to them, as we saw with much of the rhetoric that came out afterwards about Saudi Arabia needing them, etc. So this is a rather complicated diplomatic situation for the United States to deal with, whereas they cannot do the right thing without harming one of their allies, but it simply cannot ignore the situation and allow it to go on unchecked.
Thank you very much. Now, let's go back to Mr. Mark Dankoff, broadcaster from the Ugly Truth Radio, also with us. Now, Mr. Dankoff, how do you think this will affect Saudi Arabia's global image? How will particularly Mohammed bin Salman will be perceived internationally?
Well, I think it's clearly evident that this man is a criminal psychopath, and it's clearly evident that the Saudi regime is basically a criminal regime. Whether you look at what they're doing with this genocidal war in Yemen, or their collaboration with Israel and supporting these Sunni Wahhabic terror organizations in Syria. Ran a story today, basically where the head of the Saudi central bank was touting the fact that his country made $50 billion at this ongoing Riyadh Future Financial Initiative conference, and that he was also saying that banks and investment firms and companies that had boycotted this event because of the Khashoggi affair were certainly able to get on board later with quietly re-upping their investment possibilities in Riyadh with somewhat, I think it was basically implied behind the veneer of anonymity and somewhat out of public purview. So this will be business as usual in terms of the relationship between the United States and Saudi because of the.
Well, it seems that
$10 billion sale.
There seems to be some technical difficulties. We've lost Mr. Mark Dankoff, and of course, Jason Unruhe. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Press TV's special edition regarding Mr. Khashoggi's case and the recent developments. Now, we will, of course, be bringing you more updates as soon as we receive more information ourselves.